Hi friends, today we're talking about the civil rights movement. 3 video segments for you today. I'm going to do a little introduction to the topic overall, then we're going to look at the 2 readings from today, King's letter and his last sermon, and then we'll wrap up and put these all together. So we have a thesis for today. Historically, we're going to look at the rhetoric of the civil rights movement with leaders such as King and see that religious ideas undergirded calls for social change. But we'll also see what some have called the prophetic use of religious language, a critique of the nation. So both an appeal to what in King's time was kind of a common religious language, and then the use of religious language to critique the United States. Theologically, we'll touch on this question about what sustained people in the civil rights movement in the face of significant opposition and danger. And also, this raises a question about how theologians, how pastors, how religious people should engage with the nation. So I'm going to step back and do just a little bit of background, but before I do even that, I'm going to have a little caveat. So the caveat is this. Most historians, and I'm actually among them, think that focusing on Martin Luther King Jr. in the context of the civil rights movement is fairly misleading. King was obviously an important leader. He's what many people know about the civil rights movement, but he was not the civil rights movement. A lot of people in local areas up to the national level participated in the civil rights movement. I'm still going to do it this way because I think in terms of our overall class questions and project, focusing particularly on King and some of his rhetoric helps us think about some of the ideas in the course. But I do just want to note that there are a lot of things that we're not talking about by focusing on Martin Luther King. So that's the caveat. Here's some background. So I want to start and actually the end of the 19th century with a famous or infamous Supreme Court decision called Plessy versus Ferguson. This is from 1896, and this was the famous court case that said that separate but equal was constitutional. So in the case of railway cars, you could segregate them as long as they were equal. Now, what happened, of course, is that the accommodations, the schools, the neighborhoods for African Americans were separate. They were not at all equal. So Plessy versus Ferguson, for over 50 years, allowed the creation of second-class citizenship, second-class accommodations, maybe even third-class, but certainly unequal public spaces, access to law for African Americans. One of the other things to know that developed during this time was the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People. This was an organization that began work in the early part of the 20th century to protest the creation of segregated spaces and facilities and the lack of voting rights. And I bring that up simply to say that one of the things that happens sometimes with the civil rights movement is that people think that it began in 1955 when Martin Luther King helped lead a bus boycott in Montgomery, Alabama, that was the start. And it was by no means the start. The fight against segregation, the fight against the unequal voting laws, and all of those things start very, very early. I point that out for 2 reasons. First of all, simply to know that this is a long process, but also because I think it gives us a sense of what the civil rights movement was trying to combat, which was an incredibly entrenched system that a lot of people had a stake in preserving. One of the ways I think we can talk about the civil rights movement is that between 1955 and 1965, people went from really just accepting second-class citizenship to protesting it. In 10 years, everything changed. That would be amazing, but it's not what happened. This was a very, very long process. It took a lot of time, and it's simply not the case that nobody knew that Black people were bothered by segregation until 1955. There were a lot of people who had been working against it for a very long time. A key moment came in 1954 with the Brown versus Board of Education Supreme Court ruling. This Supreme Court ruling undid Plessy. It said that separate but equal was fundamentally unequal and started the desegregation of schools. This, however, did not happen quickly. Many southern states protested Brown, and the court said that they had to do this with kind of all due speed. A lot of southern states decided that that would not be very quickly. But that's to note that right at the very beginning of what we think of as the civil rights movement, there had been a Supreme Court ruling that gave backing to the idea that you could not have segregated facilities. So that's one thing that's happening in the country. But something else to keep in mind, a famous case called the Emmett Till case. So the Supreme Court in 1954 seems like it's going to be on the side of civil rights. But that isn't to say that this was going to be an easy fight. In 1955, a young boy, about 13 years old, named Emmett Till, went from his home in Chicago to visit some relatives in a small town in Mississippi called Money, Mississippi. And the account varies, but what was reported at the time is that Emmett Till was with some friends one day outside of a store, and he was talking about having a white girlfriend, and one of the kids dared him to go into the store and speak to the white woman, and she was an adult woman working there. What the claim was is that Till went in and on the way out of the store said to this woman, "Bye, baby." The woman here is pictured now claiming that her at the end of her life said that all the claims against Till were false, but even if they weren't, I mean, he said, "Bye, baby." I mean, the claim was he said, "Bye, baby," to an adult woman. In any case, that night, her husband and brother-in-law went to Till's grandfather's house, took Till, shot him, and then tied his body to a big industrial fan and dumped it into a river. The case went to court. Of course, the jury was all white. And when the defense attorney came up to give his closing argument, he said to the jury that he knew that every last Anglo-Saxon one of them would acquit the two men. The two men were acquitted of the murder, and then they gave an interview talking about how they had killed Emmett Till, but with the rule of double jeopardy, they couldn't be retried. So the Emmett Till case is a reminder that even though the Supreme Court had ruled that segregation was illegal, on the ground in places like Mississippi, this was still a matter of life and death. Black people had no sense, right, and for good reason, that, say, local authorities would protect them, that they would have fair trials. People, as they went into this movement, knew that they could be killed for what they were doing. So again, there's a kind of a national movement that's going one way, but the Emmett Till case is a reminder of how invested some people were in segregation and how little reason Black people in the South had for thinking that any authorities would help them, or really that anything could change. Another thing to just note is that Black churches had been very important in that kind of long civil rights movement, the decades of work. Not all Black churches had been involved, but Black churches had been one of the areas that had some autonomy. Black ministers tended to occupy prestigious roles in their communities. Oftentimes they had more access to education, and they were one of the few areas that really was not under a lot of outside control economically or politically from white people. When we think about the civil rights movement, I want to keep just in mind there are kind of multiple parties that are part of the civil rights movement. Certainly African Americans, we just talked about the Black churches, but I do want again to have a caveat, which is to say that not all Black people or black churches were involved in the civil rights movement. Even through the course of the civil rights movement, there were a lot of black churches, black leaders who were concerned about the risks of the civil rights movement, who weren't sure it was the right thing to do. Having said that, black churches were one source of significant support for the civil rights movement. That isn't to say that every black person involved in the civil rights movement was a Christian. We know that there were significant leaders who were not, but the black churches were a significant source of support. White Southerners, conservatives, moderates, and some liberals. I'm going to actually start with the liberals. I don't want to give the impression that every white person in the South was absolutely supportive of segregation. There had been some small movements in the South against segregation. A place called Koinonia Farms, for example, and a minister called Clarence Jordan had worked against segregation. So there were pockets of people who opposed segregation, who fought for racial equality. There were then real, what we might call, and here conservative isn't even the right word, but people very invested in segregation. We have people like the Ku Klux Klan, people who were just outright making arguments, oftentimes religious arguments, for segregation. I think, though, we need to think more about this kind of middle strata of white Southerners. A historian who I'll talk about at the end, but I'll mention now, his name is David Chappelle. It's a little bit confusing. He's not the comedian David Chappelle. He's a white historian who lives in Oklahoma named David Chappelle. Has argued persuasively that most white people in the South, and particularly ministers, people with religious power, didn't make religious arguments for segregation. Certainly not in the way that we saw, say, religious arguments for slavery. And part of what Chappelle argues is that it's actually harder to make a biblical case for segregation than it is for slavery. Now, we saw that it's hard to make a race-based case for slavery, but you can make a biblical case for slavery. It's actually much harder to do for segregation. So what you had weren't a lot of people who were saying the Bible wants this, or this is how God, said that it should be in the scripture. What they tended to make were arguments about the sanctity of culture. Sometimes they made arguments that if they were, say, ministers, that ministers had no business getting involved in politics, that civil rights was just not something ministers should be involved in because ministers shouldn't be political, which was a way of standing in support of the status quo, right? If you can't get involved politically, you actually usually are involved politically. You're just involved politically on the status quo side. But that's how a lot of white Southerners talk. So certainly not everybody in the South was making a religious argument for segregation. There were a lot of people who were just making arguments for the status quo, for Southerners being able to set up their culture however they wanted to, those kinds of things. And then we'll see that there's different groups of white Northerners. Again, a lot of people in the North, white people in the North, were not at all racial progressives. I think sometimes we have this sense that everybody in the South was deeply racist and everybody in the North was not. Certainly not. The North was absolutely divided, not necessarily by law in the same way that the South was, but by practice, and practice that was underwritten by law. So there are neighborhoods throughout the North, and we have many of them, say, in the Twin Cities, that are cities that are very divided by race in terms of their neighborhoods. Where I grew up in Seattle, very racially divided by neighborhood, and that was underwritten by law, so that, say, banks wouldn't lend to African Americans in white areas and things like that. So there were a lot of people in the North who were very happy with the racial status quo and had their own racial issues in the North. What they didn't have were like laws about lunch counters, but certainly were not invested in changing the way that race operated until well, some of them became invested in changing what the South did, but when it came to the North, less compelled. And then there were moderates and liberals too in the North, people who, in some cases, were actual racial progressives, and then some people who got on board, but maybe particularly when they were talking about what was going on in the South. And then just finally a word on the strategy of the civil rights movement. So when I was in school, the way the civil rights movement was often talked about went something like this. The civil rights movement started with the Montgomery bus boycott in 1955. And what happened in the South is that white people watched African Americans boycott buses and get hosed down in the streets, and their hearts changed. They became convinced that segregation was wrong, and so they changed. And that's what happened in the civil rights movement. That's a lovely story. It's not really what happened. The civil rights movement was, as King makes clear in his letter, very conscious of a number of decisions that its leaders were making in terms of strategy. And one part of the strategy was to go into places, and you can think of it as creating tension or letting the tension that was inherent in this system rise up, like kind of putting the screws on something so that you could see how bad that it was. And that would show the violence inherent in the system, often by getting, say, police officers to attack marchers with dogs or fire hoses, so that there was this attempt to bring forth the violence and make it very visceral. Then what that would do is it might change the hearts and minds of people in the community, but it was absolutely an attempt to get people nationwide, and particularly in the federal government, to come in and enforce laws and change laws. So, for example, the Montgomery bus boycott did not end because the Montgomery Bus Association had a profound conversion experience. The boycott ended because the Supreme Court made a ruling. And King and others in the movement were very clear that they wanted the federal government to intervene and enforce law. That's going to be important in our next section, so I just want you to kind of keep that in the back of your minds. But I think it's also just an important note that I think sometimes we have an overly romanticized view of the civil rights movement. And we need to keep in mind that there was strategy, there was a well thought out strategy, but it was also a strategy that really did aim at intervention and getting people to change laws. King was a pastor. Many of the people involved were. They were all for conversion and people changing their hearts. They also were very invested in people changing laws.